In the last couple of lectures, I hope you started getting the fundamentals of Express development. And so now is the perfect time to dive a bit deeper into how Express works, and for that we need to talk about middleware and the request response cycle. So really, the essence of Express development is to understand and then use the request response cycle. And so I want to make that idea really clear in a visual way in this video. So to start the request response cycle, our Express app receives a request when someone hits a server, for which it will then create a request and response objects. That data will then be used and processed in order to generate and send back a meaningful response. Now, in order to process that data, in Express we use something called middleware, which can manipulate the request or the response object, or really execute any other code that we'd like. So middleware doesn't always have to be just about the request or the response object, but it usually is mostly about the request. And actually, we already used middleware before. We used express.json to get access to the request body on the request object. Remember that? Now, it's called middleware, remember, because it's a function that is executed between, so in the middle of receiving the request and sending the response. And actually, we can say that in Express, everything is a middleware, even our route definitions. So again, even when we defined our routes, we can think of the route handler functions that we wrote as middleware functions. They are simply middleware functions that are only executed for certain routes. Okay? Now, some examples of middleware are express.json, which is also called body parser, and that we already used before, or some logging functionality, or setting some specific HTTP headers. The possibilities are really endless with middleware. Alright, and now in more technical terms, we say that all the middleware together that we use in our app is called the middleware stack. And what's very important to keep in mind here is that the order of middleware in the stack is actually defined by the order they are defined in the code. So a middleware that appears first in the code is executed before one that appears later. And so the order of the code matters a lot in Express, okay? Now you can think of the whole process like this. Our request and response objects that were created in the beginning go through each middleware where they are processed or where just some other code is executed. Then at the end of each middleware function, a next function is called, which is a function that we have access to in each middleware function, just like the request and response objects. And we will of course see this in code in the next video. So when we call the next function, the next middleware in the stack will be executed with the exact same request and response objects. And that happens with all the middlewares until we reach the last one. And so just like this, the initial request and response objects go through each middleware step by step. And you can think of this whole process as kind of a pipeline where our data goes through, so just like it's being piped from request to final response. Alright? Now about that last middleware function, it's usually a route handler, just like we coded before. So in this handler, we do actually not call the next function to move to the next middleware. Instead, we finally send the response data back to the client. And like this, we then finish the so-called request response cycle. Alright? So the request response cycle is really everything that we talked about here together. It starts with the incoming request, then executing all the middleware in the middleware stack step by step, and finally sending the response to finish the cycle. So you see, it's really not complicated. It's actually just a linear process. But I wish someone would have showed me something like this when I was learning how to build Express apps. I mean, I could build them, but in the beginning, I didn't really understand this entire request-response cycle like this. It was very confusing. So that's why I'm showing you this, because I believe it will be much easier for you in order to move on to the course now after understanding exactly how Express apps work.